13 Lectures on the Apocalypse by Brother Robert Roberts, his 8th lecture, Revelation 12 and 13. We have a somewhat difficult task tonight in the attempt to present a condensed and intelligible view of the matters involved in chapters 12 and 13. Our task, however, is somewhat simplified by the circumstance that some of the matters have already been under our consideration in connection with other symbols. The consideration of these matters again takes us backward in the course of time, a long way back from the point we reached at the end of the 11th chapter. You will recollect that at the end of that chapter we arrived at the time for the dead to be raised, and for the kingdoms of the world to be transferred to Christ as God's vice-regent upon earth. In chapter 12 we find ourselves again face to face with the age of Roman imperialism and circumstances of persecution, as, for instance, in verse 17, the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which kept the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. It must be evident that this is long before the transfer of the kingdoms of the world to Christ, for when that point is reached, all persecution will have ceased, power being taken from the adversary and vested in Jesus and his brethren. Hence the conclusion is self-evident, that as in the case of chapter 11, so in the case of this chapter 12, we are taken away back from the point reached at the end of the previous chapter and brought to the consideration of other scenes having to do with the prior history of human government upon earth. It may strike us as strange that there should be this zigzag sort of order in the exhibition of the scenes of the Apocalypse. This feeling will disappear if we realize that there are various departments in the divine program that have filled up the interval since Christ's departure from the earth, various areas of the Roman habitable in which the plan has been worked out, various channels in which providential superintendence has been actively given shape to events with a view to the great consummation appointed. At one time east, at another west, at another both together. By these various roads we are several times brought to the same general end to which they all reach. It is as if a guide conducted you by one route to some interesting spot, and then took you back through the air, if that were possible, to another outward place from which to conduct you again by a different route to the same spot, and repeated the performance for a third route, and so on. The opening of chapter 12 takes us back to the place in history marked by the sixth seal, when a mighty revolution upset and abolished the pagan government of the world, the avowed enemy of Christ, and established in its place a system based upon professed allegiance to Christ. This revolution, effected under the leadership of Constantine, the first Christian emperor, was a great revolution. It was, in fact, the inauguration of Christendom, the commencement of the nominal dominion of Christ on the earth, to be succeeded by his real dominion. That nominal dominion was far from being a system of real submission to Christ. Still, it was a great improvement upon the empire of polytheism in a variety of ways. There was, hereafter at least, a recognition, though in a corrupt form, of the God of Israel and the Lord Jesus Christ, and the adoption of precepts having a humanizing effect on society. In connection with this change, there were details which could not be represented by the sixth seal. The sixth seal merely exhibited the occurrence of the revolution under the symbol of a catastrophe in nature. It could not show how it affected the friends of Christ among themselves. This is what is done in chapter 12. John sees a certain woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. This woman, like all the women of the Apocalypse, was a symbolic woman. There is no difficulty in seeing whom she symbolizes. The woman represents that section of mankind which has come under submission to God through Christ, as shown by the statement in the verse already read, that the dragon made war upon the woman's seed, who are explained to be those who keep the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. The use of a woman to represent the community of those who belong to Christ is common to the writings of the apostles, as you know. Paul writes to the Corinthians, the 2nd of Corinthians 11, verse 2, "I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ." Again, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 23, "The husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church." The church is apocalyptically described as the bride, the Lamb's wife, Revelation 21, verse 9, and his union with her at his coming is spoken of as the marriage supper of the Lamb. In this 12th chapter of the Revelation, however, it is Christ's church, or ecclesia, in Christ's absence and in the land of his enemies, that is the subject of representation. Consequently, there are features about the symbol that will not appertain to the Lamb's bride in the day of her glory. In the day of her humiliation and trial, many who are in her and of her do not belong to her, as the letters of the apostles show, and also the parables of Christ, and as the fact of a judgment for separation at his coming implies. It is while she is in this mixed state that the events of this chapter occur. John sees her clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. The sun is always a symbol of power and prosperity. Those in the Roman Empire were identified with the imperial throne. Hence, for Christ's community among men to be lifted from a position of proscription and persecution into a position of political ascendancy and sunshine by the elevation of Constantine, the Church's friend, to the throne of pagan Caesarism, the Church's enemy, was for that community considered as a woman to become a woman clothed with the sun. The moon as a symbol stands in the same relation to the symbolic sun as the literal moon does to the literal sun. It is coordinate with the sun, but not equal to it. It shines with it in the same heaven, but borrows its light from it. What power in the Roman state sustained this relation to the Roman sun of imperial power? The priesthood of the national religion, undoubtedly. The religion of the gods of Rome. The pagan hierarchy stood in the same relation to imperialism as the modern established clergy do to the state. They were a power in the state, secondary to the secular power and sustained by it. The ecclesiastical order is symbolically the moon in any system. In view of this, we can understand the significance of the Christ woman having the moon under her feet, when we realize that the pagan priesthood were, by Constantine, placed under the Christian party, then elevated by him to place and power. The diadem of 12 stars is the symbol of the pagan Caesars. There had been 12 Caesars on the imperial throne, from Augustus, the first Roman emperor, to Domitian, the emperor who reigned when John received the Apocalypse. As a matter presented to John, therefore, the diadem destined to be placed on the Church's brow as the result of her conflict with paganism was a 12-starred diadem. There were other Caesars after John passed away, but the number at the date of the vision continued to represent the imperial prize of the conflict that was in progress. We have next to consider the meaning of the woman so situated, being in the state described in the second verse of the chapter we are considering. She, being with child, cried, travailing in birth and pain to be delivered. And behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. We learn the meaning of this in the contemplation of the events characterizing the history of the epoch. Constantine did not at once ascend the throne of universal dominion. He was the woman's child, political offspring of the Church, for a considerable time before he grasped the reins of universal power. His career began in the West. He was the son of Constantius, one of the 4 pagan emperors who ruled the empire conjointly at the close of the 3rd century. Constantius, whose dominion lay in Gaul, France, and Britain, considerably sympathized with the Christians and impeded the execution of the dreadful laws promulgated against them by Galerius, the chief emperor, who vowed he would obliterate the Christian name from the earth. But Constantius's son Constantine sympathized with the Christians more than his father did, and this being known at Rome caused him to be regarded with great jealousy and aversion by the other emperors. When his father died, at York, in Britain, the army proclaimed Constantine his successor in the imperial purple. It was not the place of the army at this time in the history of the empire to appoint a successor. The power lay with Galerius, the chief emperor, who, when he heard of the action of the army, was filled with rage. He, however, accepted the nomination with the determination to set it aside by the sword as soon as it was convenient. He did not acknowledge Constantine in the full rank of emperor, but gave him the 4th rank among the Roman princes, making, however, secret arrangements at the same time for the invasion of the dominions of Constantine, the western section of the Roman Empire, with a view to his deposition and destruction. Here we have the situation of the first 4 verses of the 12th chapter. The emancipated woman was pregnant with a political son, whom another power in the east was waiting to devour. This power is symbolized by a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. The identification of this power with pagan Rome is not only easy, but inevitable. We have an explanation of the heads and horns, which leaves no escape. The heads are declared to represent, chapter 17, verse 9 and 10, first, the 7 hills on which the woman at a later stage of Roman history sat enthroned. Rome is built on 7 hills, and this literal feature is incorporated in the symbol by way of identification. And secondly, 7 sovereignties, or forms of supreme power, that had succeeded one another on the 7 hills, of which the one existing in John's day was, in the verses referred to, declared to be the 6th. The 10 horns stood for the division of the empire into 10 contemporaneous independent sovereignties at a later time, chapter 17, verse 12. The symbol was a prophecy as well as an emblem. That is to say, It not only stood for the power of imperial Rome, in the way the lion stands for British power, but it exhibited details that were to be evolved in the course of its history. It is for this reason that we find pagan Rome in hostility to the Christ-woman's political son, represented by a 10-horned monster at a time when the 10 horns has not as yet historically made their appearance. If there were no other evidence that the 10-horned dragon of the chapter we're considering stands for pagan Rome at this juncture, it is found in the last 6 words of verse 3, which might easily escape the reader's notice as having anything in them. 7 crowns upon his heads. In the next chapter, 13, verse 1, the same symbol has 10 crowns on the horns and not on the heads. There is a very obvious reason for this difference. The crown is a symbol of sovereign authority. At the time of Constantine, the 10 horns had not historically appeared. Therefore they are crownless, but the heads had appeared and were in authority. For the emperorship was the 6th head or form of Roman sovereignty. The epoch current in Constantine's days was the epoch of the heads and not of the horns, which had received no kingdom as yet. Therefore the crowns are on the heads, which is of itself a convincing proof that the 7-headed dragon of Revelation 12 stands for pagan imperial Rome in its attitude of hostility to the Christian woman or church, who had in her midst a son, to whom she was about to give birth in the full-blown possession of imperial power. The birth of this imperial son was brought about by the very attitude adopted by the pagan dragon. When Constantine, the son with which the woman had just become clothed, ascertained the hostile intentions of the Roman emperor, he resolved upon taking the first step himself in the war which was about to be forced upon him. He threw his army across the Alps before Maxentius, who had taken the place of Galerius, deceased, was aware he had begun to move, and encountering the opposing army 3 times as numerous as his own, he overthrew it with great slaughter and marched towards Rome. Another army and another were collected to oppose him, but both dispersed before the celerity of his movements and the vigour of his blows, and the Roman Senate, with his 3rd victory at Saxa Rubra, threw open the gates of Rome and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. Thus the woman's son was born after a season of acute parturition agonies. But he was not yet what he was destined to become, sole monarch of the Roman world. This destiny is expressed by the symbolism of verse 5. She brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. Some apply this to the ascension of Christ. A moment's reflection will suffice to show this is a mistake. What John saw was a representation of things which a voice told him, Revelation 4 verse 1, must come to pass hereafter. He was told this AD 96. How then could this scene represent an event that had taken place 60 years before? Besides, such an interpretation would ignore the primary characteristic of the Apocalypse as an exhibition of things in sign or hieroglyph. No, the woman in the case is the Christian community, and her son the imperial champion, begotten in her midst as the result of the operation of her principles on Roman society. This son being born and caught up to God and to his throne was, 1. to become developed as an acknowledged emperor, and 2, to be elevated in the operations of providence into the position of sole monarch of the world. God ruleth in the kingdoms of men, Daniel 4 verse 32. Hence for Constantine to be placed over them all by the force of circumstances was symbolically to be caught up to God and to his throne. This came about in due time.